This documentary is about a man who, in our opinion, was one of the most influential leaders of the 19th century. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was President of the United States from 1932 until 1944. He captained our nation for 12 years before succumbing to a brain aneurysm he suffered at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. He showed great leadership from the beginning, coming into office during the Great Depression. Within his first 100 days in office, most of the legislation that became known as the New Deal was passed. The New Deal provided recovery and relief to the American people and reform to the governments and the financial system so that a disaster of this scale could never happen again. Then, with the problems of the Great Depression still up front and center, the Empire of Japan launched a sneak attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the United States was drawn into World War II. FDR displayed incredible leadership as Commander-in-Chief of our nation's armed forces by surrounding himself with many competent advisors so that he could make informed decisions on the war. The creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the organization of many other pre-wartime and wartime programs which kept Britain in fighting shape. The effects of FDR's leadership can be seen in many places throughout the world. Many New Deal programs are still active today, such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Securities Exchange Commission, and they still help watch over the stock market and the finances of the U.S. During the war, FDR organized things so that the alliance between the Big Three was run from Washington, and the men he appointed to leadership in the Army and Navy in every case proved to be effective leaders and influential generals throughout the worldwide scope of the war. This eventually led to our victory over the Axis in 1945 after FDR's death. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, to James Roosevelt and Sarah Ann Delano. FDR grew up in an atmosphere of privilege and attended an Episcopal boarding school in Massachusetts. Then, once he graduated, he attended Harvard College. Described as an average student and an unremarkable athlete, Roosevelt did take control of the Harvard Crimson Daily newspaper. It was during this time that Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin's fifth cousin, assumed the presidency. Franklin graduated from Harvard in 1903 and began studying at Columbia Law School in 1904, but dropped out 3 years later. During this time, he married Eleanor Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt gave her away at their wedding because Eleanor's father had died when she was 10. They moved into their family's estate at Springwood, and Franklin got a job at a law firm on Wall Street. It was during this time that FDR began his longtime affair with Lucy Mercer.
In 1913, FDR was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. While in this position, he worked to expand the Navy and created the U.S. Navy Reserves. In 1914, Roosevelt attempted to run for the New York Senate but lost by a 3-1 margin. In 1917, he requested permission from President Wilson to fit the naval fleet for war but was denied. In 1920, FDR chose to run as the vice president for James Cox, the governor of Ohio.
In 1921, FDR contracted polio, which left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. He tried a wide variety of treatments and in 1926 bought a resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, and founded a hydrotherapy center for other polio patients, which still operates to some extent today. He then went on to found the March of Dimes, or as it was called then, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. This greatly affected his political life as he wanted to project the image of a strong leader, not one that was paralyzed. So he created iron leg braces and taught himself to walk short distances with a cane. Only in private did he use a wheelchair. Great care was taken to prevent the press from highlighting his disability of any form. This was so effective that only 2 known photos of FDR in a wheelchair are known to exist today. He also drove a car with hand controls to give him further mobility. FDR served as governor of New York from 1929 until he was elected president in 1932. As governor, he started many new social programs. While running for governor a second time, it is alleged that he made use of the Tammany Hall political machine. While his opponent pointed this out, the Republican nominee couldn't overcome the public's blame of his party for the Great Depression, and Roosevelt was elected by a margin of 14%. During Roosevelt's first term as governor of New York, the stock market collapsed, losing $14 billion and setting off the worldwide Great Depression. During this time, the incumbent president, Herbert Hoover, didn't do much to help things. His strong belief in rugged individualism led him to believe that it was better to let people die than offer them help. This didn't win him very many supporters. Then, when Hoover ordered the U.S. military to open fire on the veterans and the bonus army, the public completely lost faith in him. So when FDR ran against Hoover in the 1932 election, Roosevelt won 57% of the vote. When FDR was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933, a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Industry had lost more than half of its production since 1929, 2 million people were homeless, prices had fallen over 60%, and 32 states had closed their banks. In short, we were in the midst of the worst depression the world had ever seen. Roosevelt's answer to this was the New Deal. This was characterized by relief, recovery, and reform. During the first 100 days of his administration, he began enacting many laws to give relief to the people. The day after his election, he declared a bank holiday, which closed every bank in the nation. He then signed a law to create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, a program for the federal government to insure banks. He then enacted programs to get the unemployed working, such as the WPA, the CCC, and the TVA. These programs hired 250,000 people. In 1934, he created the SEC, a program to oversee the stock market and shut it down if too much was lost in one day. During this time, he also repealed Prohibition, and in 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, which provided a set income to the elderly, widows, and orphans. He also passed the National Labor Relations Act, established the rights of workers to organize, engage in strikes, and collective bargaining. During his second term, the Supreme Court overturned many of his policies, including the National Recovery Act, which they deemed unconstitutional. He attempted to sign a bill into law which would allow him to appoint up to 6 new justices, but it wasn't passed in the Congress.
Then suddenly, on December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a sneak attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. This attack knocked out the main American battleship fleet and killed 2,403 servicemen and civilians. Simultaneously, they also bombed the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway. The next day, FDR gave his infamy speech to Congress asking them to declare war against Japan, and on that day, the U.S. declared war on the Axis powers.
After traveling back to the U.S. after the Yalta Conference, FDR was exhausted. Once he arrived home, he traveled down to his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. His health had been steadily deteriorating since the beginning of the war and was now worse than ever. FDR had become a chain smoker, lost 40 to 50 pounds since his first election, and looked easily 10 years older than when the war had began. Also, he was excited because his longtime mistress, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, was coming down to Warm Springs to see him and was bringing along her friend and artist Elizabeth Shumatoff to paint a good picture of FDR to bring a better image than the latest press photographs that had displayed him as very gaunt. On the morning of April 12th, FDR woke up and ate a light breakfast. While Elizabeth painted his picture, FDR did some light work and read the newspaper. FDR suddenly slumped forward and cried out, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," and then sank into unconsciousness. As help was summoned and FDR was carried into his bedroom, Lucy realized how bad the situation was and told Shumatoff to pack up her pants, and they both left quickly. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pronounced dead at 3:35 p.m. on April 12, 1945. Later that day, Harry Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. On April 15th, FDR's funeral parade ran through Washington, D.C., and he was laid to rest in his beloved estate in Hyde Park, New York. Finally, after 7 years of war, Nazi Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, after Adolf Hitler committed suicide. 4 months later, after the use of 2 atomic bombs, Japan signed the Statement of Unconditional Surrender on the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, and the war was over. In total, over 72 million people had died.
Over the expanse of his life, FDR's legacy is more than evident in the United States. His leadership through the darkest financial crisis in U.S. history gave relief to many of the people who lost everything, got more jobs available for people who needed it, and created legislation to make sure nothing like that could ever happen again. Through the war, FDR proved himself again to be an able leader.
His foresight brought around the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb and a whole new age of warfare. Though he died before its completion, his steady hand led us through the deadliest war in human history and stopped the spread of fascism dead in its tracks.